What is the game? What is the aim? The aim is to win elections after communal violence. The policemen who had played the BJP game had to be rewarded. Those who had tried to do their job properly had to be sidelined. You have a practice of crony capitalism that is very specific. Gujarat is, of course, well known for big entrepreneurs, business families, but it was a state of small and medium enterprises also. It was a very vibrant state in terms of entrepreneurship. These mega projects were given to friends of the government. Of course, the case we all know about is Mundra, the SEZ that was given to Gautam Adani in 2003. Narendra Modi is not an RSS creature. At least he was a product of the RSS, of course, but he tried to emancipate himself as chief minister from the RSS and from all the other organizations.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. Professor Christophe Jaffrelot is one of the foremost international scholars on India and South Asia. The eminent political scientist has written several books, including two recent ones on Narendra Modi. The Indian edition of his latest book, Gujarat Under Modi, The Blueprint of Today's India, was released earlier this week. This book was originally written in 2013, but legal teams of his publishers had a lot of questions about it, and it remained unpublished. It arrives now, and it is very interesting to see how prescient it was. Professor Jaffrelot, who is the director of Center for International Relations at Sciences Po in Paris and professor of Indian politics at King's College, London, has been a regular visitor to India for several decades, but he stopped coming after 2020. He joins me to talk about his book, The Elections, where he sees India today and in the future. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. Professor Jaffrelot, the Indian edition of your book has just been released, with the elections just about over. You write in your preface that you wrote this book in 2013 but couldn't publish it then. I find it interesting that you also say that you have hardly made any changes in the 2024 election. What does this tell us?
Well, it tells us that we knew before. By 2013, we knew what were the pillars of what has been called Moditva, the Hindu nationalist version of Narendra Modi, invented by Narendra Modi in Gujarat. And this is exactly the topic of this book. This book is really on what are the pillars of this politics and how they could be translated or transposed at the national level. And this is, as a political scientist, the most important lesson I've learned. Never ever before had an Indian politician who had made its career at the provincial level, at the regional level, be in a position to replicate at the national level what he had invented at the state level. So we knew what were the four pillars of Narendra Modi's politics in 2013. And we have seen, after now 10 years, since 2014, that they could be replicated. They could be transposed. They could be, if you want, scaled up at the national level. That's what the book is about.
Yeah. So could you tell us about those four pillars?
Sure, of course. Well, of course, number one is polarization. It's a politics of polarization. And Gujarat, of course, was a laboratory for polarization, communal polarization. And when you look at the largest Hindu-Muslim riots in post-independence India, they took place in Gujarat more often than not. 1969, 1985, 1992, and of course 2002. Hmm? Always the largest and the most bloody riot. In fact, Ahmedabad could beat Bombay at that game if you look at the per capita number of casualties in these different riots. This is something that predated Narendra Modi's Gujarat, for sure. But that is something he has, if you want, cultivated, made more sophisticated as early as the mid 1980s when he is um, secretary, organizing secretary of BJP for Gujarat. And of course, 2002 is the culminating point of this strategy of polarization, which worked well. In fact, what is the game? What is the aim? The aim is to win elections after communal violence. And the book uses a lot of very detailed analysis showing that in 2002, the number of seats BJP won was much larger in the places where the riots had been at its worst. So there is a correlation between electoral success and communal polarization. So that's the number one pillar that has been clearly replicated at the national level, and the election campaign that is finishing these days shows that it remains the main plank of Narendra Modi so far as identity politics is concerned. The second pillar, of course, has to do with the capture of institutions, including the police and the judiciary, two key institutions that had to be taken care of course, after the pogrom, especially the police. The policemen who had played the BJP game had to be rewarded. Those who had tried to do their job properly had to be sidelined. And those who had been rewarded could still be used for other purposes. Again, polarization, by the way. Fake encounters. The series of fake encounters we saw in Gujarat after 2003 helped the government to continue to polarize by other means. I don't know if you remember, but we had a series of fake encounters, including the Sohrabuddin case. There were many. And every time, policemen said they had to eliminate jihadists supported by Pakistan, by ISI, coming from the other side, belonging to Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed, and who were there to kill Narendra Modi himself. The press conferences of Vanzara, for instance, tell us these kind of things, which meant that the police had been instrumentalized, had been communalized. Something, by the way, that was there before in Gujarat. It's not as if the Gujarat police had not been already very much involved in all kinds of trafficking. And in fact, you have to go back to Abdul Latif and the 1980s for seeing that this police was vulnerable already, to say the least. But that's a different story. With Amit Shah as Minister for Home, or Minister of State for Home, you have the use of the police for political purposes.
Which we have seen at the national level in a different way.
Again, you can see how the same recipe has been indeed transferred at the national level, with sometimes the same people, by the way. So many IPS, so many IPS officers, so many IAS officers have traveled from Gandhinagar to Delhi after 2014. So you have this continuity that is very much there. The third pillar has to do with the political economy of Gujarat. And I would make 2 points there. One, you have a practice of crony capitalism that is very specific. Gujarat is, of course, well known for big entrepreneurs, business families. But it was a state of small and medium enterprises also. It was a very vibrant state in terms of entrepreneurship. With Narendra Modi at the helm, you see an emphasis on mega projects, huge projects, in the form of special economic zones. In many cases, you have a record number of ACZs, 60 ACZs in Gujarat, when there is one in Uttar Pradesh at that time, for instance. And these ACZs, these mega projects, were given to friends of the government. Of course, the case we all know about is Mundra, the ACZ that was given to Gautam Adani in 2003, after Gautam Adani supported Narendra Modi at the Confederation of Indian Industry, where there were dissenting voices telling the government of Gujarat what happened in 2002 was not good for the economy. So Narendra Modi was supported by a group of entrepreneurs, including Gautam Adani, in 2003 itself, and was rewarded with something like Mundra, many other things. So what is the idea? The idea is you give land at a throwaway price. You also give almost 0% interest rate loans, tax deduction, and you speed up the process. When the nano factory was started near Ahmedabad, it was a very quick process. And Ratan Tata himself says, I was amazed by the way the chief minister of Gujarat responded to my, not only responded, but anticipated my expectations. That's a new form of crony capitalism. We knew that there was a special relationship between Dhirubhai Ambani and Mrs. Gandhi, but nothing of that magnitude, nothing of that closeness, nothing of that promiscuity. A nexus of a different kind has taken shape in Gujarat, and again has been pursued afterwards. The same people who were there in Gujarat are now here at the pan-India level. The other point I would like to make on the political economy side is this is a policy that invests a lot in infrastructure. These mega projects especially are good for road making, railway lines, like the Ahmedabad-Bombay bullet train. It's an infrastructure-oriented political economy at the expense of social expenditures. Very little investment in education and health. When you compare Gujarat with states of India with a similar level of development, you compare Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, you compare Gujarat and Karnataka, because they are almost of the same level of development in terms of per capita revenue, and you see the big difference. The big difference is hardly any money for education and health, and also very low wages and very few good jobs, largely
no unionization. That's critical.
And no unionization, and a very weak public sector, very few jobs in the public sector. It has been privatized. What is very surprising is also the gap between rural Gujarat and urban Gujarat. It's all for the urban dwellers, at the expense of farmers, at the expense of course, peasantry at large. So this is something we will see after 2014 as well. Inequalities have increased, joblessness has increased, and there is again a similarity that shows a continuity in the two, if you want, frameworks, the regional one and the national one. Last, I don't want to to give too many details, but the fourth pillar, that of course is the most obvious one, is the style of politics that Narendra Modi invented in Gujarat and that has been replicated at the national level. I call it national populist. This is a style that is populist because the institutions are all circumvented. And in the first place, the political party itself. Now, Narendra Modi is not supported by BJP in Gujarat, at least in the beginning. Keshubhai Patel tries to become president of the Gujarat BJP and is sidelined, is marginalized. RSS cadres, including Mohan Vej at that time, as Pran Pracharak, try to retain some control over BJP. And in the 2007 elections, they are shown the door, and Mohan Vej will end in Chennai. So Narendra Modi is not an RSS creature. At least he was a product of the RSS, of course, but he tried to emancipate himself as chief minister from the RSS and from all the other organizations. Look at the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. He broke with Togaria, for instance. Look at the Bharatiya Kisan Sangh. They were at the loggerheads because of the policy of Narendra Modi. So what did he do? He tried to build his own parallel power structure. He had his own relays in society. And how do you do that? By using technology. So he's the first one to use the phones, mobile phones, the social media, the holograms. That's one very important dimension of populism. You relate directly to the people by circumventing, short-circuiting the institutions which were supposed to be your instruments of power. But there is more than that. It's a style that will rely on a very clear personality cult. You look at the 2007 election campaign, for instance, and it's all about the superhuman powers of Narendra Modi, who as a child could swim with the crocodiles, who could swallow poison, who could do extraordinary things. So the idea that this man is above the human nature is already there. Today he says, I'm not biological. In 2007, he was already showing that his quality was superior to the human essence. Now, that's a very important dimension of his charisma. And this style has been propagated by all the media I have listed. Also because he could rely on PR companies. Even before Kishore, even before 2012, Kishore took care of his 2012 election campaign. But before that, you could see him relying on APCO Worldwide, a Washington-based PR company that did most of the publicity work for Vibrant Gujarat in the first place, but after Vibrant Gujarat, for him only. So this is something we know very well now. How you build an image, how you make someone a hero. But that was invented in Gujarat in the first decade of the 21st century. And I don't think we had ever seen something like that before in India. Of course, Indira Gandhi was very good at promoting her own image and personality, but not to that extent.
No. Also, there was no social media in those days, if you remember, or PR companies. At best, it was, slogans on the side of a bus or, All India Radio or Doordarshan or something like that. But these
Yeah,
were state instruments,
yeah,
and nowhere on this scale.
exactly.
And no foreign company was being paid to build up this cult. Now, you've raised so many interesting points, Professor, that I don't know where to go. But there's one thing that jumps out at me, and that is that deinstitutionalization. You mentioned the party organizations, but more than that, the national organizations. At the Gujarat level, it was the police, and you could control the judiciary up to a point. Here, you have the ED, the income tax, the Central Bureau of Investigation, and parts of the judiciary which you may try to control, because the judiciary sometimes shows a different kind of independent approach. And now you have the election commission. We are in the middle of this, the last stages of the election. The results will be announced, and the election commission has in the last 2 months shown that it has no spine when it comes to tackling things about Mr. Modi. Let's be blunt about it.
Yeah.
That's a somewhat risky and dangerous situation, isn't it?
Well, of course, of course. Well, you have different scenarios according to the institution you turn to. I would begin with the case of the judiciary, and then I'll say a few words about the election commission and other bureaucrats. In the case of the judiciary, I think they could play on three different factors. One, judges retire at 60. They are still very young. To get a post-retirement job is something many of them value a lot. And some of them are prepared to indulge in self-censorship for preparing their future after retirement. And there is no cool-off period anymore. You jump from one position to another one. And when Mr. Rajan Gogoi became a Rajya Sabha member, he was freshly retired. He had very freshly retired from the Supreme Court, for instance. Number one. Number two, there are cases on many judges. It's not as if they were all clean, completely clean. And this government has a file on everybody and can blackmail people in the name of potential cases. Number two.
That's a strong statement, but go ahead, yes.
Number three, well, we know the collegium system. Judges are supposed to designate judges at the Supreme Court, justices of the Supreme Court. But they select names, they don't appoint people. So what we've seen in the past is an attempt at promoting to the Supreme Court judges of high courts who were not of the liking of the government. They were selected, but they were not appointed. The government could sit on these quote-unquote recommendations for months, for years, and finally you could not replace the judges who had retired. And as a result, the size of the Supreme Court shrank. There were attempts at repeating the applications to no avail. So finally, you have a temptation to select the judges who are likely to be confirmed by the government instead of taking the risk of appointing someone who will not be confirmed. And there is a fourth explanation, but well, there is a clear attempt at infiltrating the judiciary by the RSS for a long time. And we have some indications that some of the High Court judges, at least, Supreme Court judges possibly have affinities, if not relationship, with the organization itself. And that's another additional factor. Now on the bureaucrats and the Election Commission in particular. Well, this is a clear example of capture of institutions. And I remember in 2013, 2014, many of my colleagues were saying, well, there's no harm trying Narendra Modi as prime minister. We have robust institutions. India has robust democratic institutions. If there is any attempt at deviating for the democratic path, the institutions will take care of that. Well, what we see is that it's not so complicated to twist the arms of bureaucrats. It's not so complicated to appoint bureaucrats who are prepared to implement your policy and not the policy of the state or the policy of the republic. And the Election Commission's trajectory is a great illustration of this. You change people the day before, you appoint your man in the right place. Done. How can you counter that? There is no place for countering that, except the Supreme Court, but we are back to square one. And the Supreme Court will certainly try to show that it has retained some independence, but it will not fight the way Iftikhar Chaudhry has fought Musharraf in Pakistan. That's not the style. That's
this far and no further.
Exactly.
So there are no Krishna Iyers in the Supreme Court who during the emergency was, or even later.
Yeah, because the emergency, Sidharth, remember, there was only one man. There was only Justice Khanna, but none of the others.
And then, but later, Krishna Iyer was a man who took on the government on various places.
But so, I'm glad you mentioned the emergency, because as you may remember, I did a book with Pratina Vandi on the emergency, and it helped me to understand Modi's India. Because you see the replication, the repeat of some of the behaviors we saw during the emergency, especially within the judiciary.
Yeah, and the media.
Same. Well, in the case of the media, of course, crony capitalism plays a big role, because the moment you sell TV channels to friends of the government, you can't expect free and fair information. You have a recipe for disinformation, a bias. So it goes with crony capitalism. Something, by the way, we saw elsewhere in the world. You know, Orban has done the same in Hungary. You privatize some of the public media or universities or whatever, or you help your friends to capture TV channels or even the print media, and then everybody withdraws in its shell. Except that in India, what is really fascinating is the resilience of what we can call the independent media, and the success of YouTube channels, or the success of your Wire, the Wire Scroll, make it still easier to get access to some information compared to a country like Hungary, for instance, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, well, discussing the media would require another 2 hours. All I can say is that while this while this is absolutely true that if the cronies control the media, they own the media, their views, the government's views will get predominance. But also I'm also convinced that a lot of the journalists and a lot of the editors are themselves ready to do the government's bidding. So it's not only, you can blame the owners, of course, which I would, but I think the journalist class has also very happily shifted.
Well, this is a question that goes beyond the journalist. So many people have fallen in line, not only among the journalists, among the academics, among the bureaucrats, among so many groups. Then the question is he saying something people were thinking secretly without daring to say it publicly? And now they are intimately persuaded, convinced that this is the right politics. This is a question that only non-directive interviews could help us to figure out. Is communalism, Hindu nationalism, the real reason why people have forgotten the rules of the Indian democracy and happily supported the Modi government? I'm not sure, and I can't say really, but it's one of the hypotheses for responding to your questions. Why have so many people not resisted?
So actually, that brings me to the next question. We don't want to focus too much on the results because that will be known, but Mr. Modi has, since you mentioned that why have so many people got convinced or not resisted, he has managed to also do something politically over and above all these things that you mentioned. And that is, and then you can link it with what happened in Gujarat and explain it to us. Uh, he has managed to sew up a coalition that cuts across not just caste but also class.
Yeah.
For example, upper castes, OBCs, Dalits, all support him. Urban rich, rural poor, businessmen, professionals, they all support him. So my question is divided into two parts. One is this something that is something that you had seen earlier in Gujarat, and therefore this was inevitable on a national scale? And second, is such a self-contradictory coalition likely to hold
Yeah.
in the future? Or has it already shown signs of wearing and tearing?
No, these are key questions. In fact, the last part of the book, the fifth part of the book, the fourth first part are on the four pillars. The fifth part is on who have supported this politics and who has suffered from that same politics. Well, clearly, you have a support base that goes beyond the usual suspects. Yes, as early as the 2000s, Modi is supported by non-upper caste voters, people he will call in 2012 the neo-middle class. This neo-middle class is made of all the people who come from OBCs, who come from the village, but who migrate to the city and who expect that they will benefit from a growth rate that is almost double digit. No, these are the aspiring categories. And at that time, it worked well because you had sufficient growth for cultivating this hope that you will benefit. And if you remember well, when Arun Jaitley was finance minister, he continued with this idea of the neo middle class. You know, the first budget of the Narendra Modi government, 2015, is replete with references to this neo middle class. So that crossed against across caste. The other reason why you could be a cross caste and class coalition, you could build a cross caste and class coalition, was of course Hindu identity. And this is my theory for now 20 years. For me, the rise of Hindutva is the response to Mandal in the first place. And the Rath Yatra of 1990, that is such an important turning point, is a response to VP Singh's announcement of the implementation of the Mandal report. The idea is that the antidote to the rise of lower caste is Hindu nationalism, is the Hindu identity. So they continued with that, and they played on what we call Sanskritization in social sciences. You know, make the lower caste people feel like they are part of the mainstream society, of the upper caste dominated ethos. And the Ayodhya movement is all about that. Yeah? And you bring Dalits, you bring as many low caste people you can in this movement. So these are the two reasons why you can have plebeians supporting Narendra Modi. There is a third reason, of course. He is one of them. He is one of them, and he will play on that. Not so much in Gujarat, by the way. It's mostly after 2014, when he has to win over Bihar, when he has to win over UP, that he will promote his image of a Chaivala, of an OBC. But that is also an important factor. And the fourth and last one is what I call is politics of dignity, a new kind of welfareism. The welfare programs of Narendra Modi are very well publicized. Swachh Bharat, Ujjwal Yojana. So you give a gas cylinder to the poor with the photograph of Narendra Modi on it, and you do something that shows that he cares for you. This is again populism, direct relationship. Something you find also in Man Ki Baat. You know, every month Narendra Modi speaks to the poor, claiming that he is their spokesperson, that is their guide. But recognition, acknowledgement, you know, that gives a sense of dignity, of self-esteem. So it's a kind of welfareism that is almost immaterial. Of course, there is some materiality. You receive a gas cylinder, but it's one shot, and it's much less than what the previous government had done. And the way they have reduced NRAGA to a kind of minuscule program is a reflection of this shift from support, material support, to immaterial support, psychological recognition. But that works, and it explains largely why you have so many plebeians behind Narendra Modi. Now, is that sustainable? Well, it's a very important question, and I think these elections will tell us whether you can indeed use what Marx would call the opium of the people forever, or whether there is a limit to that. Joblessness has reached such an amazing level that sometimes you wonder whether instead of building temples, people would prefer to get proper jobs, and that's one of the questions this election will respond to. But there is one last point I wanted to make, and it has to do with caste politics. One of the reasons why you see so many Dalits or OBCs voting for the BJP in 2014, 2019 has to do with what I call the paradox of reservations. Reservations have been cornered by dominant Dalits, Jatavs in Uttar Pradesh, Mahars in Maharashtra, or by dominant OBCs, Yadavs in Uttar Pradesh or in Bihar. And there are Dalits who resent this and will resent the way the BSP on the one hand, the SP or the RJD on the other hand, have not given their due to smaller Dalit jatis, to smaller OBC jatis. You know, the Katiks, the Bangis or Balmikis, or so many others on the OBC sides. And BJP has been very good, and Amit Shah has been very good at nominating candidates from these smaller Dalit jatis or OBC jatis. They are the ones who support BJP and shift from BSP or SP to BJP. Have they realized that it has not made any difference to their condition after 5 or 10 years? This is also a key question for the elections, for the current elections. And very last point, Sidharth, we also need to somewhat relativize the popularity of BJP. After all, it never crossed the 37% mark. So yes, it has achieved something very few parties had achieved before, to get almost as many votes from all categories of society. You have to go back to Mrs. Gandhi in the 70s for having this kind of populist equal attractivity of or appeal. But none of these categories go beyond 40%. So yes, it's a dominant party, but not an hegemonic party. And there are so many states where it is number 2, number 3, number 4, that we need to also retain this kind of sense of proportion.
I think all the ambient noise, the media, the posters, the billboards, the constant speeches, etc., build up this image. But that's we'll keep that aside. Now, the interesting part is that one of the, you mentioned the Dalit support. Though I can't understand why OBC support should come if they were reacting against Mandal, but it has come. But one of the players or one of the issues I would solve this, but it almost became a character in this campaign for the last 3 months, 2 months especially, is the constitution. The constitution suddenly became an issue, and that's because of reservation and because Rahul Gandhi constantly moved around with the constitution, and that became a talking point. You find that interesting?
It is. But to return to your question, why do OBCs support Hindutva if it is a response to Mandal? Because Mandal has not benefited to all the OBCs. And you know, my conclusion there is we need to revisit the quota policies. You should have quotas within quotas. Otherwise, you will leave aside people who will be always more than happy to support BJP against the parties claiming to represent the OBCs or the Dalits. That's a very important policy reform that has to be made, especially because privatization makes quotas less and less, relevant. Yes, no, this interest in the constitution is very interesting. By the way, you may remember that it was during the anti-CAA protest that we saw the constitution in the hands of the people in Shaheen Bagh or elsewhere. So it's a sequel of that, but of course from a different perspective. Because when they claim that they would like to get the 400 seats for reforming the constitution, they attacked a monument, and especially for the Dalits. Not only because, yes, it is in the constitution that you have the framework for reservations, but this is Dr. Ambedkar's work. How can you attack something that has this kind of pedigree? Now, the constitution should be implemented fully, and not only in regard to the reservations, and that's something we don't refer to sufficiently. Now, look at, for instance, the articles which are supposed to promote multiculturalism. There are articles in the list of the fundamental rights, the most important rights, that should make multiculturalism sacred, in the sense that minorities are entitled there to have their own schools, for instance. Look at all the attacks on madrasas and others. So the constitution needs to be certainly, revalorized, taught more, promoted more, and not only for sectional interest like reservations.
I like the word revalorized. Certainly, I think what it has done, and that I think is a very, very positive sign, is that it has brought itself to the notice of a younger cohort, which may not be thinking in terms of reservation necessarily, but does think in terms of secularism or human rights. And they're saying, oh, the constitution, let's find out more about the constitution. And that's an opening, I think, many parties could exploit, perhaps, if they are less cynical about these things being election ploys. Coming to the opposition parties, I know we are taking up a lot of time, but this is fascinating. Professor, you saw the opposition parties more or less adjusting, bearing their differences, and coming together, more or less. Seat arrangements have been pretty good. You have the amazing scenarios of Congress people supporting AAP, Congress supporters supporting Uddhav Thackeray, and Uddhav Thackeray's Sena supporting the Congress. These are quite interesting developments. Do you think there is any scope for or hope for opposition parties continuing some kind of momentum? Of course, it will depend on the results. I understand that. But a kind of momentum has been established. Do you think it will continue?
Well, it's interesting to compare again, because you've seen this kind of developments everywhere, in every country where a strong man has won 1, 2, 3 elections in a row. There is a moment when all the opposition parties decide to close ranks, because this is the only way they can survive and dislodge the man from power. So you've seen this in Turkey, you've seen this in Israel, you've seen this in Hungary, in Poland, and sometimes it works. In Poland, it did work. Sometimes it fails. Everywhere else, it has failed. Well, Turkey is an interesting case because Erdogan has lost the local elections because of the unity of the opposition. And unity going from, the extreme right to the extreme left. In this kind of context, everybody close ranks, irrespective of your ideology, irrespective of your support base. You have only one objective: to get rid of the man at the top. We are seeing the same thing in India. It took quite some time. It took 10 years for opposition parties to realize that it was he or them. And the more authoritarian they are, freezing the bank accounts of the largest opposition party, putting chief ministers behind bars, Kejriwal, Soren, the more these parties are, of course, convinced that they have to close ranks to save their skin, to exist. And this is for me the key element. Is this unity only a reaction to a threat that is posed to all of them? Or is there a positive agenda behind? If there is a positive agenda, I would respond to your question, they have a bright future. Because there is a program that has to be developed in India. More jobs, more equality, more redistribution, more federalism. Well, the list is very long. Everybody can find it useful for the country. And in a way, this is what UPA did for 10 years. Manmohan Singh's coalition was exactly this kind of very large coalition of parties having differences, but a common agenda in terms of development. I would use development as the key word there. This is the main point. Are they sufficiently aware of the need for a positive agenda, or are they there only to save their skin in their state or at the national level in the case of Congress? Only the future will tell us. Some parties are on the fence. I mean, Mamata has not played such a positive role in West Bengal. Will they also join hands if they realize that in West Bengal, well, they have suffered because of not joining hands with the others? Now, this election will give us a lot of indications for the future of this coalition. But it's in any case an important development, because you can't have a proper democracy without a balance of power, and they have created the conditions for some balance of power.
Professor, I'm sitting in Paris. You probably be able to explain this far better than many of us here. Modi and his government have done things that would normally offend Western governments, which constantly talk of human rights, which talk of minority rights, etc. Plus the allegation made by the Canadian and American governments about Indian agents trying to kill their citizen. And yet no government has really taken any serious action of the kind they would have with other countries. Why is that? Why does he get such a free pass?
Well, I think there are two reasons. Well, maybe three. The third reason could be we speak a lot about human rights. It's not a priority in the West. And what we see today in Gaza is more or less a reconfirmation of this, if you want, hypocrisy. But let's focus on the two other reasons. One, there is this idea that India will help the West to resist China. We all know in the West that India is not in a position to contain China, either because of its resources or because of its fear of alienating China. But to have India on the fence, not taking sides, is already good enough. So that's the number one reason, a lesser evil compared to the threat that China is posing to the, as they say, liberal global order. But the other reason is, I would say, purely economic. This is the largest country in the world. You can't ignore this market. Everybody hopes that one day, everybody in the West hopes that one day there'll be money to make. And there are already deals, arms deals in the first place. When you look at who is selling arms to India, India being the largest market with Saudi Arabia and few others, well, you see the French, Israelis, American companies playing a big role. Now, it's not something that can remain necessarily forever, because there is, number one, a suspicion that this market may not be that easy, and that great. And number two, I think what will be very important will be the Russia factor. Um, the kind of friendliness that continues to be there in the India-Russia relations. The fact that India is, quote unquote, bailing out Russia on the oil front, that may become a complicated, that may create a complicated situation if Russia wins that war. Because then there'll be a soul searching exercise in the West, and they will reconsider what are their allies really. And then we are not talking about partnerships, or no, allies. You'll have to have something that resemble the Cold War period, two camps.
So that time, India has to take sides.
I'm afraid it will be difficult not to take side in a context when, again, I repeat, that will be the trauma. A Russia victory in Ukraine will be a trauma for the West, and that will take us back to the Cold War atmosphere, with us or without, or against us. So let's see whether this kind of plurilateralism that India is implemented is sustainable in a context that may become more tragic, more dramatic, more polarized at the end.
Okay, one last question. I think you write in your book that you haven't visited since 2020. I can understand the first 2 years were COVID related, but it's been 2 years since then. Is there any special reason?
Well, there are many different reasons. One, I have amassed so much material in these, well, 40 years of doing fieldwork in India, that I need now to write. And I've just completed with a colleague, Vanessa Caru, History of Bombay. So that kept me busy for quite some time. Another reason is my fieldwork today is in Kartarpur, where I'm working on Guru Nanak's legacy and the attractiveness of this place on people from all kinds of religions and origins, and I find it really fascinating. And the third reason is I prefer to wait a little bit and see whether I can find again the atmosphere that was there before, that I missed so much, because you end up with a nostalgia of what was India till recently. And I prefer to live with this memory of what was the country, what were the people. People have changed also. And it's not so easy to reconcile yourself with this transformation. So once I will have overcome that, I'll try to come, and we'll see whether I can.
Whether you can, but however, you don't want to come to an India which does not fit in with what you remember sweetly about the country, the best of India that you remember. That's very well put. I'm sure you'll be able to come sooner than later. So thank you very much, Professor, for
Thank
this
you, Sidharth.
magnificent tour the politics, if I may call it, if that is the correct French phrase. You've given us a very, very well rounded understanding of where you see Indian politics today, where it has reached and how it has reached here. That's very, very important, because your book on Gujarat under Modi, or Modi's Gujarat, tells us, I have read quite a bit of it. I just recently got it, but I managed to read quite a bit of it. Tells us that anybody who understood those years that Mr. Modi was in Gujarat should have seen this coming. And maybe some people were waiting for this to come. Maybe some people were dreading this, but the signs were there. So thank you very much for A, writing this book and bringing it to us, and B, for this magnificent conversation.
Thank you, Sidharth. Thanks a lot.
That's Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, eminent political scientist, who is talking to us about what his latest book about Modi in Gujarat, which took 10 years in the making. I suggest you pick up the book and find out why. And we'll be back soon enough with another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, goodbye.